Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever in the world you're joining us from. Welcome to the second Oxford University Press History Book Club meeting. My name is Susan Ferber, and I'm one of the history editors at OUP. On behalf of my colleagues, thank you for taking the time to join us today. For those of you who were present at the inaugural book club meeting in April featuring Thomas Holt's The Movement, welcome back. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, here's a little background. Reading and talking about books in a group has a long tradition. In the late 18th and 19th century, the first secular American reading circles or conversations, the precursor to book clubs, were begun by women in homes, mills, empty classrooms, and wherever they could find quiet space. They required little more than a thirst for literature and a desire to discuss it with like-minded individuals. That's the spirit in which this book club was founded. What we lack in the intimacy of a small group in a living room or a coffee shop, I hope we can gain in creating a broad community of readers. This book club will give you the chance to directly interact with authors, as well as an opportunity to continue the conversation online with others in the book club. Every meeting will feature two OUP authors in conversation, in this case, the writer of a new book with one of our classic titles. Over time, we aim to share histories from across the globe, from a variety of periods of history, and many different authorial perspectives. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our book and our authors today. This is the most bare bones description of these historians, since we could easily take an hour to talk just about their accomplishments. Kevin J. Weddle is professor of military theory and strategy at the U.S. Army War College. A West Point graduate, he served in the U.S. Army for 28 years before retiring as a colonel. He is the author of Lincoln's Tragic Admiral, The Life of Samuel Francis DuPont, and of course today's book, The Compleat Victory, Saratoga and the American Revolution, which is part of the Pivotal Moments in American History series. He's joined in conversation by Benjamin L. Carp, the Daniel M. Lyons Professor of History at Brooklyn College and at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He is the author of numerous books, including his first one, which is an OUP book, Rebels Rising, Cities and the American Revolution. Kevin and Ben are going to speak for about 25 minutes, and then the floor will be open to all of your questions. You could start putting them in the chat anytime, and my colleague Erin Cox will bring up as many as she can in the second half hour. You could also go to @OUP History Twitter feed and comment using the hashtag OUP History Book Club. So welcome, Kevin and Ben, and thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Susan.
Thank you, Susan. Kevin, I'm excited to talk to you about this book, which I really enjoyed reading, and I have lots of questions, some of which come from my own reading on the Revolution, and some of which I just want to talk about more.
Sure.
So we'll do the opposite of what Mary Poppins suggests and start at the end. What were the consequences of the Saratoga campaign? Why is it important?
Yeah, well, I kind of break it down into some short-term consequences and long-term consequences. So when you look at Saratoga and the American Revolution at this period of time, so Saratoga, the surrender of the British Army took place on the 17th of October, 1777. So there's two major British armies in North America. There's Burgoyne's army that surrenders on the 17th. And then there's the main British army at this point is down near Philadelphia, fighting the Philadelphia campaign. So at a stroke, the British lose one of their two major field armies in the United States. It's a big deal, obviously. Huge boost in American morale, obviously, with this victory. In Britain, it started, there was an opposition in Parliament to the American War, and this just emboldened this very vocal minority in the British Parliament, and they start gaining a little bit of speed and a little bit of power within Parliament. So that's going to have an impact on British politics. So all that is taking place. And then at the same time, it jumpstarts the American diplomatic effort in France to get French recognition of American independence, and also to come in covertly. They've been supporting us in a covert manner, but now to get them to overtly support the Americans, and that diplomatic effort will pay off when the Americans and the French sign their dual treaties of amity and commerce and Treaty of Alliance in February of '78. So now at that point then, after Saratoga and the French come in on the war, the British are now faced with something they absolutely didn't want to deal with, which is now a wider war, essentially almost a global war, because ultimately Spain will come in, and really it'll be almost going back to the 7 Years' War kind of thing. So it's going to be a global war and something that they absolutely did not want to deal with.
Okay. Well, so then where did the British go wrong? Why do they fail in their ambitions for the 1777 campaign?
I think you need to trace it all the way back to late 1776, early 1777. And that's when the British recognize, after the campaigns in New York, after the failed attempt to invade New York from Canada in the fall of 1776, after those campaigns, I think they realize that this war is not going to end, right now. It's not going to end quickly. So we're going to have to come up with a new plan for 1777 to, once and for all, end this rebellion and get back to some kind of normality. And so the British in late 1776, early 1777, start developing this plan for 1777, this military plan, military strategy. And I think that almost everything that happens in this campaign, and of course it's a very complex campaign. We'll probably get into it a little bit later, but very complex. 10 battles and engagements. It's played out over hundreds, maybe thousands of square miles of New York wilderness. Almost everything that happens can be traced back to that strategy. Because once they establish this strategy and they build this strategy, everything kind of flows from that. And the strategy that they develop, and I argue in the book that it was fatally flawed. The strategy was, number one, the initial strategy to begin with, I don't think was all that great. But then they made it worse by not coordinating the strategy, not making sure that everybody was on the same sheet of music, everybody was pulling on the same rope, which is really important when you're developing any sort of strategy. The overall objective wasn't all that sound. It wasn't that well defined. They made a lot of bad assumptions that don't turn out to be true, which is a problem. And we can talk about that. As a military planner myself, that's one of the big pitfalls of a military planner. You make an assumption, which is fine. Sometimes you have to make assumptions because you don't have perfect knowledge when you build a plan. But if you are making assumptions, you need to think through sort of the second and third order effects of what's going to happen if that assumption proves not to be true. So they really kind of fail in the fundamentals, which is developing a good, sound strategy. And so from that flawed strategy will ultimately end with their defeat.
Okay, well, now I got to ask you to elaborate on two of those things. So what is the strategy or the overall objective that they're going for, and what are some of these mistaken assumptions? And the other question, which was going to be my next question, so you could answer these in any order, is who are we talking about? Who are the important figures for understanding this story?
Yeah, there's a number of important figures here. Maybe this might actually, since we're going to talk about the figures, this might be a good time to show those images that you and I talked about. Let me just quickly share my screen here. Okay. So what I want to show everybody is some of the key people. So British military strategy here as we enter 1777 in North America is really run by these two people, at least the folks on the ground. And on the left, you have General Sir William Howe. He's the British Commander-in-Chief in North America, minus Canada. And then on the right, there is his brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe, who's commanding the Royal Navy in North America. So they're the ones on the ground there in America. Of course, we can get back to Washington later. But these are the primary architects of British military strategy in 1777. So at the top there, you have the King George III. He plays in this. He's instrumental in making some personnel decisions or personnel recommendations in particular. On the right, we just mentioned Sir William Howe, General Sir William Howe, the Commander-in-Chief. At the bottom is Lieutenant General John Burgoyne. Now, John Burgoyne was second in command in Canada in 1776. He has since come home to Great Britain. And at this point, late 76, early 77, he's in London. And then on the left, you have Lord George Germain. Lord George Germain is Secretary of State for the Colonies. And so his role is basically to manage the war in North America, manage the American War. So those are really the four big players in creating this strategy. So Burgoyne and Howe both come up with their own plans. Now remember, Howe is in New York, Burgoyne is in London. So Burgoyne can press his case directly to the king and Lord Germain. So there's 3,000 miles between them. Now they're going to come up with two separate plans. So those, anyway, so that goes back to your original question, Ben. Those are the big players that we're talking about in creating British strategy. And your second question,
well, so like, what is the plan? What is the overall objective that the British are laying out that they fail at?
Right. Okay. So again, as I mentioned, Howe and Burgoyne both present their own individual plans. So this is Burgoyne's plan. Now it's a very imaginative plan. It's very complex. In fact, I would say that if we tried to pull something like this off today, it would be a challenge. We could probably do it, but it would be a challenge. And back then, when you had really very difficult communications, you had vast distances over wilderness territory, it makes it really, really tough. But it was very, very popular. The king and Germain really loved this plan. And basically what Burgoyne's plan calls for is 3 converging columns of soldiers, basically 3 armies, would converge and meet at Albany, New York. And the idea was to basically seize control of the Hudson River Valley, the Hudson Highlands, all the way up to Albany, basically splitting the more rebellious New England colonies away from what was thought were the less rebellious middle colonies and southern colonies. And so then there was supposed to be some follow-on operations, very undefined kind of follow-on operations into New England, but again, very, very undefined on what really they wanted to do once they linked up. So it would look something like this. You had the main British Army in Canada would come down south on Lake Champlain, ultimately getting to Albany. You'd have another smaller army this was more of a secondary force. This was to kind of relieve pressure off that first column. They would come down the St. Lawrence Seaway, or not, there was no St. Lawrence Seaway at the time, St. Lawrence River into Lake Ontario, then to Oswego, and then to the Mohawk River, go down the Mohawk River to Albany. And then the main British Army in New York City would come up the Hudson, again, using Lord Howe's, Admiral Howe's ships. They would come up the Hudson. They'd all have a junction at Albany, not necessarily a physical junction, but certainly close junction. And then in that way, they would control the Hudson River Valley and then be able to conduct some sort of other operations. So that was Burgoyne's plan. The king loved it. Germain loved it. This would sort of be a reprise of what they tried in the fall of 1776. So Howe, though, General Howe, remember, he's the commander-in-chief in North America, 3,000 miles away. He comes up with his own plan. Because of what happens at Princeton, the battles of Princeton and Trenton, late 1776, early 1777, George Washington's able to, as we know, after he's kicked out of New York, Manhattan, Long Island, those battles, the army is melting away very quickly. He's got to do something to reverse the bleeding, basically. And he's able to do that with the famous crossing of the Delaware and the fight on Christmas Day at Trenton, and then followed up not long afterwards with the victory at Princeton. So after that, Howe recognizes that, at this point, he recognizes that Washington and his army are the true centers of gravity of this revolution. If I can defeat, hopefully destroy Washington and his army, the rebellion will probably fritter away. So that's Howe's feeling. And actually, I argue in the book, I think he was right about Some may disagree with me on that. But his plan then is to take his big army, his main army, go to Philadelphia, the seat of the Congress, and that would force Washington to defend the nominal American capital. And in that way, he'd force Washington to come out. He'd be able to defeat Washington. War over. So so there's Philadelphia there that I just circled. There you can see his army. Next to that, the blue there is Washington's army. He first considers going overland, but he really doesn't have any stomach to do that. He doesn't want to march overland across New Jersey. He's going to have to leave so many troops behind to guard his lines of communications back to New York. Plus, during that winter, Washington's been doing some hit and run operations against him. He has no stomach for that. So he decides to use the mobility that his brother's Navy gives him, and he decides to go by sea. So he rejects going overland, and he decides to go by sea. So his plan is he's going to load up on Royal Navy ships and transports, and that he's either going to go up the Delaware or go up the Chesapeake Bay and then go after Philadelphia. So that's his plan. Again, he thinks that Washington will be forced then to come and defend Philadelphia. So you have those two competing plans. So it's up to Germain, Secretary of State for the Colonies, to reconcile those plans, or to pick one or the other and go with it, or somehow reconcile it and coordinate those two plans.
Let me interject and ask a question.
Yeah.
Is strategy everything, right? What about the vagaries of the battlefield, right? The fog of war.
Sure.
And as a subset, why are two words that you use in the book? Why are grip and grit important qualities in a leader once you're on the ground there? To use the phrase used before.
Yeah. Let me start with the first one. Obviously, you're always going to have. I'm a Clausewitzian, so I mean, you're always going to have that. And Clausewitz argues, of course, that the nature of war is always the same, right? You're always going to have friction. You're always going to have, as you said, you're always going to have chance. War is a supremely human endeavor. So it's a personal thing. It's personal relationships. It's leadership. All those things. So, but strategy is key. You've got to develop an overall plan, an overarching plan, and then all of your commanders have to understand that plan, understand what your intent is, so that when they get into trouble or they're by themselves and they have to make decisions, they sort of understand what they need to do in the absence of somebody telling them what to do. So strategy is absolutely key. It doesn't mean that that strategy isn't going to change, or that it's going to go wrong, or your initial plan is going to go awry. That's going to happen. Clausewitz tells us that. History tells us that. That's always going to happen. But if you've got a fundamentally good strategy that you've thought through and that you reassess as you're going along, that assumption that I first made isn't panning out, so I have to come up with some sort of a way to work around that. That's why strategy is so very important. Going back to your comment about leadership, I think the two threads that work themselves through my book are strategy and leadership. And as part of that, I sort of seized on this notion of grip, and I sort of love doing that. I was teaching I was a visiting professor at Princeton a couple of years ago, and I was teaching a course on Allied leadership in World War II, and specifically Operation Overlord. And Field Marshal Montgomery, famous Field Marshal, of course, we all know about Montgomery in World War II, had this notion of, a great leader, a great senior leader has to have grip. And what he meant by that was this senior leader has to understand all the ins and outs of their army. So, you've got to understand the logistics. You've got to understand all of your leaders. You have to have good relationships with those guys. You have to understand tactics. You have to understand all the little things. And a commander that does that has grip. They got a good grip on their unit and what they have to accomplish. I sort of expanded that out a little bit to include that, but to also encompass what Clausewitz calls more as genius. and that is a senior leader who understands, who has this sort of second sense that when they need to, for instance, send the reserves in, or when the enemy is starting to weaken and you've got to now, deal the final blow, those kind of things. Sensing when an enemy is on the ropes, sensing when you have to pull back if you have to do that. And that's rare in a leader. It's usually based on a lot of experience, making a lot of mistakes and learning from it. Also studying your profession, understanding your profession. So the great leaders military leaders in history, the folks like, Alexander the Great, Napoleon, I'd say U.S. Grant, Patton, they all have grip. And so I sort of use this as sort of the ideal, and I sort of evaluated these leaders on both sides using that, my own little definition of grip.
No, it's really a vivid theme. All right, there are a few questions that I really want to make sure I get to before we open it up. All right, the first is you write a couple of really great chapters on the Battle of Freeman's Farms and Bemis Heights, but your book also convinced me that wasn't it all over for Burgoyne by mid-September, right? Like before either of those battles, and once he crosses the Hudson, right? Given all the prior decisions by the American commanders, by the British commanders, is there anything Burgoyne could have done at that point to turn things around? I mean, it seems like his options, even for retreating by mid-September, had become quite limited.
They were limited. I think, of course, you can never, war is so unpredictable. You never know how things might turn out, and of course, the American army is increasing in size by this time because the militia are really coming out. And so, by the time of that first battle of Freeman's Farm, the armies are basically equal. And just a couple weeks later in the second battle, the Americans have a huge numerical superiority, mostly because of the militia. I guess I would say that after the Battle of Freeman's Farm, I think if he had made the decision at that point to pull back, he may have still had a chance. And that's because most of Gates's reinforcements by that time were again militia, and so calling on militia to do a vigorous pursuit is might be kind of tough for them. On the other hand, he still had Arnold. Arnold had not suffered his serious wound that he does on the second battle, so you still have the very aggressive Arnold. So certainly Arnold would have done a really good job in a vigorous pursuit. But I think that was his last chance, because you can argue that he won the Battle of Freeman's Farm because he forced the Americans to fall back. So maybe he could have used that, that little bit of initiative, or the little bit of advantage to exploit that to fall back. But I really think that was his last opportunity. When he decides to dig in and hopefully wait for Clinton to come in to his aid, or maybe even press on to Albany, he was doomed at that point when he decided to dig in.
Okay. All right. So the other question that I really want to make sure, I want to quote a passage from your book on page 382. You say that a military leader's objective must lead to accomplishing a larger, usually political goal, right? This references our discussion of strategy before. And then you say, how much blood and treasure have been wasted by those who simply send troops into harm's way to do something with no defined goal, other than hoping that the action in and of itself would somehow lead to a happy result. I had to ask when I was reading that line, is this gesturing at some other example in US history or world history, right? What do you think leads political and military leaders to make this kind of mistake, to kind of do something without really having thought through the potential consequences?
Oh, sure. And I think, all we have to do is look back about the last 30 years and we can see several examples of that. They obviously, you can't detach strategy from policy and the small d domestic politics issues, partisan politics issues. They obviously play a role. I mean, I just think back to Somalia. The cameras showing the starving people, who doesn't want to help the people of Somalia when that was happening, and President Bush Bush 1 decides to have this military intervention, and then it takes on a life of its own. He was, what was his overall goal there? It was to do something. I've got to feed these people. Okay, right, we got to do that, but once we inject all these soldiers there and we start taking some casualties and things start happening, now what is the goal? You have to continually reassess your strategy. And that's a perfect example of and it happens all the time. I mean, people just getting sucked into something. We pour more troops, and pretty soon we've got a real problem on our hands. And that, you look at Iraq, you can look at Afghanistan, same sorts of things. It's a real trap, and it's to be fair, it's an understandable trap, given domestic political realities and mass media and media coverage and media pressure, political pressure, pressure from the population, polls. It's understandable. It's just something that I think leaders have to guard against.
And even in a constitutional monarchy like Great Britain in the 18th century, right, they have to worry about what's in the press, what the opposition is saying.
Absolutely.
And so we bring it back to 1777, right? You show how this is a moment when, this idea of the Hudson Champlain Valley and meeting up at Albany, looks really good on paper. Let's do it, right? And then,
right.
But you show how that strategy has failed. All right, I'm a big fan of New York State public historians and our tourism industry. You mentioned that you visited a lot of the sites where some of these battles took place. Can you talk a little bit about which one of these was your favorite, or which one of them do you think they tell the story really well, or which one of them really shaped the writing of the book?
Yeah, of course, Saratoga. But I think actually three places really I just loved visiting. One was Fort Stanwix.
Okay.
I really didn't have, I probably, one of the things that I think sets off my book a little bit is I talk about the entire campaign, and I think I give full coverage of the entire campaign. And part of that is the siege of Fort Stanwix. And because I like to, compare and contrast Stanwix with Ticonderoga. So, visiting Fort Stanwix was the first time I had ever been there. And I just thought it was just really interesting. I didn't really have a good feel for the size of the fort until I was there to see the reconstruction. And then right next to that, of course, just a few miles away is the site of the Battle of Oriskany. If you blink, you'll pass it by driving on the road. It's just a little state site. But I really got a great feel for the ravines and where the fighting took place in the woods and how horrific that fighting was. The other thing I really enjoyed was the site of the Battle of Hubbardton. The little rear guard action from the American Army as it retreated from Fort Ticonderoga. It probably saved the main body, at least you can argue that. It's this little Vermont. It's the only battle in the Revolutionary War that was fought in Vermont. And so it's a little state site, but in fact, there's probably fewer people who live there now than lived there then. You really have to want to go there in order to go there because it's way out of the way. But I loved it because it's totally unspoiled. You can really get a feel for the terrain. And as a career combat engineer officer, I mean, terrain is my thing. So really enjoyed seeing all that. And you can really tell how the battle played out just by looking at the terrain. And then the last place was Fort Independence, across the way from Fort Ticonderoga, just across the lake. Because you can look back, you can look up at Mount Defiance, where the British were able to drag cannon up to the top of Mount Defiance. You were able to see that and see why that was a critically important piece of terrain. As well. So I enjoyed those three were my favorite.
It's funny because it comes out in the writing. I mean, you reminded me how good the chapter on Hubbardton was, but my favorite chapter by far is when you talk Oriskany. It's for potential readers, it's the book is worth the price of admission just for that chapter alone. It just
thanks,
really
man.
cinematic, very well done. I promised I wouldn't spend half an hour gushing about the book, but I did have to mention that that was my favorite.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right. Well, what was your favorite chapter then to write? Maybe you already answered the question.
Yeah, actually, I think Stanwix was. I think and that included the Battle of Oriskany. So yeah, because part of it is I really fell. You shouldn't do this, I guess, as a writer. You know, Ben. I sort of fell in love with the American leaders at Stanwix. I mean, these two young, a colonel and his lieutenant colonel, young guys. They're thrown into a really tough situation. They're outnumbered 3-1. And they just do a wonderful job of just excellent leadership, and it was really I think it's an inspiring story that most people don't have no idea about.
I think Edith Wharton was descended from Gansevoort. I have to double check that.
Herman Melville. Herman Melville is descended from Peter Gansevoort.
Actually, I think the families intermarried, right? Because the families intermarried. Okay. Right. And so Wharton is descended from both Thomas Melville, who participated in the Boston Tea Party. This is from my previous book, and then also from Gansevoort. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, great.
It could be that his mother was a Gansevoort, that Herman Melville's mother was a Gansevoort. Now
Yeah, great.
But all right. So what was the most challenging thing, the most difficult thing about writing a book of this just massive scope and trying to get into the diplomacy and the British politics and the American politics? And we barely even talked about the American side of things, even though that's something you develop really well in the book.
Yeah. I think the biggest challenge for me, and I really got a lot of help from Tim Bent, my great editor at OUP. It was trying to talk about the British strategy development at the beginning of the book, and not putting everybody to sleep at that point, because it can be pretty dense and confusing, and not all that. It can be not all that interesting, but it's so important to set the stage, I think, and Tim helped me do that. He encouraged me to take a lot of the stuff out of that and put it into an appendix, which I did with all the letters. So I think you can try to connect the dots on why the strategy became uncoordinated, because they basically approved both plans, both Howe's and Burgoyne's plans, which of course is not a good idea. So you had this, these competing strategies, and it was just a disaster. But that I think was a big challenge for me to try to make that interesting.
I think it's I don't think it's hard to get people to be interested in the strategy, but I think just getting people to understand the basic premise of like how difficult the lag in communications made it, right? Like we take for granted we can just text somebody, pick up the phone. Right. For them that's like, all right, hopefully they'll get this message in 6 weeks, right?
Right.
And
then I have to get a response.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So and so if you're the genealogy of that, the appendix might well be helpful. Yeah, but the narrative works on its own. I didn't even consult the appendix.
Right. Well, and that's and so and you have the Secretary of State for the Colonies who's trying to micromanage the war, and from 3,000 miles away, that's kind of tough. Like you said, could be 6 weeks, could be 2 months to send and get a reply. So it's that was tough.
Or more, yeah. All right, I do have a question about the American side. All right, Benedict Arnold, Horatio Gates, Dearborn, Hull, right? They come off pretty well in the book, even though, right, later in their careers, right, only with Wilkinson, right, do you kind of hint in the book at like his later behavior. But for the most part, actually, for the others, until you get to those little what happened to these guys next in another appendix in your book, you mostly don't talk during the text of like, history remembers these guys very differently. But for the most part, those four, and maybe even all five of them, acquit themselves pretty well during, in 1777. So, I mean, what's the best way for a historian to kind of render judgments on these individual military leaders? Is it better to kind of take the whole scope of their lives, or to just kind of focus on how they did in the job at hand? Did you think about like, the War of 1812 as you're talking about Hull and Dearborn, or think about Benedict Arnold's betrayal, because it doesn't really enter the text as far as I can tell.
And of course, of course I know that, and it's in the back of my mind. But I guess what I tried to do you can tell me if you think I succeeded, but what I tried to do was be as fair as I possibly could with those guys. And so, I'm just looking at what they were doing then and not what happens afterward. Now, Wilkinson, I had to bring that in a little bit because it's his sources that so many people are depending on, and he writes that many years later after he has all his issues. So
we don't rely on the other guy's take as much, but historians have relied on Wilkinson for
right. And for the other guys like Gates, I'm relying on his papers, his contemporary papers that he's writing then. So I can't, I'm not going to talk about what happened to him after the Battle of Camden, much later. So I try to be as fair as I possibly could with them. And so, for instance, Gates. I mean, I am not a big fan of Gates at all. I think he's awful actually, but I think his unique skill set, being a decent manager, understanding logistics, being able to handle the militia really well, and he's popular in New England, so they like him, so that's important. And he's a specialist in defensive warfare. All that played in perfectly with the circumstances he was handed when he was given command of the Northern Army in August of 1777. And the same with what was happening on the other side. So it all fit in perfectly with Gates. So this kind of perfect storm of good things happened to Gates. I think he fell into this great situation, and he was able to exploit it. So good on him that he was able to exploit that situation. After that, I don't care for him very much at all. So.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. This is great. Loved it.
We have a few questions from the audience, and I just want to introduce myself to the audience. I'm Erin Cox from Oxford University Press, and thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you, Ben and Kevin, for this fascinating conversation. We have just a couple questions from the audience that sort of take it back a little bit. So Kevin, the one question that we're sort of delving into is, this is a well-covered territory. How did you sort of get the inspiration to sort of approach it from a different angle and sort of start with the idea? Did an idea come to you? Do you see the strategy and say, oh, this is the entry point? Or how did you come to write this book?
Yeah. How did I come to write? Well, I really have to thank David Hackett Fisher. He, of course, is the author of several Oxford books, to include the Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington's Crossing. So I met him at Jim McPherson's, another Oxford University Press great author, Jim McPherson at Jim's retirement. So they're very close friends. And David said he had read my first book on Admiral DuPont, and he liked it and all that. So that was gratifying to hear. And he contacted me later saying, hey, we're looking for somebody to write about Saratoga for the pivotal moments in American history. And you had told me that you're interested in the American Revolution. Would you be interested? And so I put in a proposal. Tim accepted it, and so that's really how it started. As for the kind of the hook that I used with strategy and leadership. In part, that's I've always been interested in that, but and as a professional Army officer, that kind of fits with what I do. But also, that's what I teach at the Army War College. I teach strategy, and I also teach military theory, but mainly strategy and leadership at the Army War College. So it fit perfectly. And the more I got into the literature, I thought, well, that would be. I want to cover the entire thing. I want to talk about the tactics and the battles and everything else, but I want to have these two threads that I hope will sort of weave themselves throughout the book. And so that's how I sort of latched on to strategy and leadership. And I ran it by David. He thought it was a good idea, so I ran with that.
That's good. Well, and just speaking about strategy, that's a question from the audience as well. When you're looking at strategy now with warfare, how does technology, you got, the two of you had talked about technology then, and obviously you have to wait for responses, and how does technology and identity and security and space and time, how does that fit into strategy today? And then when you're looking at, the American Revolution, is it hard to sort of remove those, current strategic ideas when sort of examining that period and what's happening then?
I don't think it's hard at all, actually, because, and I go back to, I go back to the fact that I'm sort of a Clausewitzian, and Clausewitz, argued that, and I think he's absolutely right, that the nature of war is unchanging. And so the basics of strategy, the basics of leadership, the basics of war, and Ben and I already talked about, friction, fog of war, chance, all those things remain. Doesn't matter how good your technology is, doesn't matter how good your communications is today or then, or in ancient times, it's all the same. When you read Thucydides, it's all the same. What changes is the technology and, a little bit, but everything else remains the same. So when you're talking about strategy and the fundamentals of strategy in 1777, they're the same as today, I would argue. So, for instance, I talk a little bit about assumptions. When Burgoyne makes his plan, one of his assumptions is that he decides to leave Canada without all the logistics support he needs. He's taking a risk. And the reason he's able to do that, he thinks, is he assumes that the American loyalists, which they thought were just, throughout the upper part of New York, they would flock to his aid. He'd be able to get food and supplies and transport and horses and oxen and carts and all that stuff from the American loyalists. Turns out not to be the case. Well, flash forward to Iraq, 2003. We assume that, the Iraqis would, welcome us with open arms and, all that. Well, they do initially, but that assumption quickly turns out to be false. So when you're developing strategy, you have to deal with those possibilities. So Burgoyne, if, just like our strategists in 2003, just like they didn't do, Burgoyne didn't in 1777 kind of think through the ramifications of what if the loyalists decide not to play, which they don't, basically. They don't come out in droves to help him. Some, there's a handful come out and help him, but not the huge support that he expects to happen. Same with Native Americans. He assumes he's going to get this huge contingent of Native Americans to help him. It's a much smaller contingent that he had hoped for. He thought he was going to be able to keep them throughout. They desert on him after the Battle of Bennington. All sorts of things. So you have to think through the ramifications of what happens if my assumptions do not pan out. Same is true today as was true back then. So I don't think it was all that hard to do. Some things stay the same.
Yeah.
I'd be interested in what Ben would think about that.
Oh, wait, we can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry, I muted myself. I mean, I'm torn, right? Because on the one hand, I'm very interested in, this idea of continuity, right? That there are some things that are fundamental to war and universal, almost philosophical principles. But I'm an 18th century guy, and I like to think of the 18th century as special. And so what I get interested in, and I think you're still effective at in the book, are what are the particular things that enter into the mindset of an 18th century person, of their feelings about what Wayne Lee would call the culture of warfare, and things like that. That there are some things that are kind of unique to the 18th century mindset that we don't necessarily share in the same way today, right? Historians like to get very particular about time and place.
Right. No, I agree with you completely on that.
And that was one of the questions I was going to ask you is, how did you find studying the Revolution different? Because, the audience may not know this, but in your teaching and research, you do World War II, you do Civil War, right? Like you've studied a lot, and obviously you're knowledgeable about the last 30 years of warfare as well, right? Like, what struck you as being particular to the Revolution or to the 18th century?
Yeah, again, I guess I focus more on the continuities than not. The distance is the huge thing, and I frankly didn't get that much into like you were saying, the culture of the the 18th century soldier. I guess I was
hold
looking
on,
more
hold on, right? Like today we kind of take for granted that like if two soldiers in the US Army, if one is from Arkansas and one is from Massachusetts, that's not really going to, affect their ability to have, to have unit cohesion, right? Or something like that, right? But in the early 1777, still, right, these regional rivalries, the things that make, Gates more popular among New Englanders and Schuyler more important among New Yorkers, that stuff really matters, right? And in my, I've been studying this 1776, and and there it really matters. And so it was interesting to me reading your book to see that those kind of intercolonial or interstate at that point, those interstate rivalries still matter, right? That's something very specific to the moment, right?
Well, that's true. That's true. You're right. And in fact, now that I think about it, a great example of that is, of course, the whole Mohawk River, the Mohawk Valley issue with basically brother against brother, loyalists and Tories in that area, and then all these connections with the Native Americans in the region. You're right. Yeah, absolutely.
The idea of these interpersonal relationships and Herkimer having this important local influence, I do think that stuff is really coming out, and you really have to have read the stuff and read through both primary and secondary sources to really kind of understand the factors, right? That's what grip is about, right? Is sort of understanding your moment. Anyway, I'm only parroting what I learned from you in this book.
No, but I guess I still stick with my basic comment that in the scope of the book, I guess I would look more at continuities than not. But yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about the being immersed in 18th century. If a reader is not as immersed as the two of you are in the culture and time and what's going on, how what's a good entry point into sort of better understanding both the time and maybe battlefield strategy at the time? Are there other things to read, or is it where did you sort of learn some of the basics of that?
I'm going to defer to Ben. I mean, he's the actual American Revolution expert.
Well, look, we have to introduce this to students, some of whom may come in with no background at all, or just a basic K-12 education. But the way I was going to ask this question is, I think it was Wayne Lee in an article pointed out, but I'm sure this is not a unique to him, that there are three audiences for any military history book like this, right? There's the general public audience, there's a potential academic audience, and then there's the kind of professional military education audience. And that's sort of where you're coming from. And being able to write a book that hits all three of those and can say something new to all three of those audiences is really a challenge for any author. And so I guess I was just wondering if you had that in mind at all when you were writing, because they are all kind of coming from different levels of knowledge, right? They all want different things from a military history book. So I was curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I didn't consciously think it through that way, but I think the book turned out that you could argue that. I definitely tried to give the audience a lot of background at the beginning. Those first couple chapters tried to set the stage. So I did try to do that. So if you didn't have a whole lot of knowledge about the American Revolution, you could jump in and at least get a feel for what happened before, leading up to the campaign. And certainly the concluding chapter, I'd like to think, provides some halfway decent lessons learned, I think, from the campaign that one of my students, one of my colonels in one of my seminars here could read and go, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Because of what I've studied earlier in the course or whatever. So yeah, great point.
So we have a couple of questions from the audience. Was this war a complete victory, or did the British run out of political will to continue, parallel with Vietnam?
Oh, that's well, it was. certainly okay, here's how I would approach that. The war ends with Yorktown, where the American army under Washington is supported by a French army and a French fleet. And it happens in 1781. I would argue that you can't have that. You can't have a Yorktown without a Saratoga. Didn't have to be Saratoga, but it had to be some sort of a Saratoga, because you had to get the French to come in. You had to get that kind of support. It had to be a wider war. I mean, the British, I have a whole chapter on the British reaction after Saratoga and how they try to create a new strategy then for 1778 and onwards. And they're just, once the French come in, they basically say, hey, the Americans are now a secondary theater. The French are number one on our hit list now. And that's just the way it's got to be. So poor General Clinton now, who's the new commander in chief, he's now commanding a secondary theater. He's going to get the fewest amount of reinforcements, the fewest amount of resources. And he's also told, and put down the rebellion. So, I mean, he's got a really tough job at that point. And then, there's been all sorts of things written about the Southern campaigns. Brand new book just came out. John Ferling just came out with a book just talking about the last 3 years of the war. I haven't read it yet, but I saw it at Barnes & Noble the other day. It looks really good. But that last part of the war, it's not that they didn't have will. I mean, they have, they want to still win this thing up until, at least the leadership does, up until 1781. So it's not a collapse of will. I think it's a collapse of having to, now you've got your focus is now diverted to the French as well. Now you've got this wider war, and you just don't have the resources to prosecute, both wars, a global war, and put down the American rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
It might hurt our ego as Americans, but the American colonies on the mainland were never as important to Britain as the Caribbean.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. That's where the money was coming. Yep.
How does the British perspective look at Saratoga? You're very fair to all sides, but have there been perspectives on Saratoga that are a little bit different, written from a British perspective?
Well, I try to spend a lot of time on the British perspective in the book, both before and after the campaign, and it was a shock to the system when they lose. On the 2nd of December of 1777 is when the news arrives, and Horace Walpole writes in his diary, and of course you can take or leave Walpole. I mean, he may or may not have been correct, but he was tied into the top circles. He said basically the king collapsed when he heard the news. It was such a shock. It was a big deal, and the British press starts turning on the war. As I mentioned early on in our discussion, there already was an opposition to the American war in the British Parliament. That widens now. It's bringing in a lot of big players, big names. You've got the Duke of Marlborough says when he finds out that the British are going to continue the war, he says, well, if you're going to send more troops to America, you might as well just dump them in the middle of the ocean for all the good they're going to do us. So there's starting to be some pushback. And now with the French coming in, now you have to worry about homeland defense. You have to worry about defending your possessions in the Caribbean, like Ben said, all over the place. Gibraltar, all these places now that you didn't have to really worry about too much before. You've got Ireland. All
India.
Sorts of issues that the Brits have to worry about now, or at least it's really complicated their situation now.
That's the hard part of having an empire, right? Too many fronts.
It's funny when you read British historians from the 19th century, they're all gaga over George Washington. Actually, they really admire him. Lord Mahon and Lecky and Trevelyan. They're like it's fascinating. Anyway.
Yeah.
And they did during the war too. Like you'll read the the British press.
Oh yeah.
They're like, yeah, this guy's pretty admirable. Actually, we think of him as an Englishman.
Yeah, yeah. It's really interesting when you read the parliamentary debates. They're doing the same thing. Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Well, we just have a couple minutes left. So we have one question that says, "What is your next book project?" Each of you. What are you working on now? Or do you working on an idea for something next?
Yeah, Ben, go ahead.
Well, I'm writing a book on a very different kind of warfare. So 5 days after the British occupy New York City in September of 1776, about a sixth of Manhattan, of the developed part of Manhattan, burns down, and so I'm writing a book about that fire, the 21st day of September in 1776.
Wow. And Kevin, what are you working on now?
I've got a couple ideas in mind, but I haven't latched onto one of them yet. So sorry, I can't really. Yeah, just because it hasn't clarified in my mind yet.
Right. You're working on the promotion for the Compleat victory. You're still talking about Saratoga.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Any last things that you want the audience who's watching from all over the world to think about this battle and think about the American Revolution? Any last words? Last thoughts?
Oh, just that I think, when we look back at Saratoga, it's important to remember it wasn't just the final two battles that we all remember and that we all read about as school children and told about. Well, there was Saratoga, and that was really important because they lost an army. There was a lot of other things going on. There's so many things that were involved in it. It was very complex. And, George Washington, we never got a chance to talk about him really. He plays a huge role in the success of Saratoga, so I think that's important. And the repercussions of Saratoga, helped establish the United States. So it's really important. And I'd just like to conclude by thanking everybody for taking the time to jump on Facebook or jump on here to help us out. And Ben, you were great. I love the discussion. Great questions. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I enjoyed the book, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you both, and thank you to everybody for watching. I'm going to drop a little link here in the chat for everybody to go and buy both of your books, and also to check out our next one, which is going to be on June 3rd. We will have our next book club meeting with Madeline Shu and Annalise Hines talking about Mahjong, a Chinese game and the making of modern American culture. So everybody visit that link and join us for the next conversation. Thank you again, gentlemen. We so enjoyed having you, and thanks for the great conversation.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.